Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel on shrinking space for civic discourses, hosted very generously by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which I should add is a subscriber to Puck, which is where I am. I'm Julia Ioffe. I'm a founding partner and Washington correspondent for Puck. Thank you so much to Carnegie for inviting me to moderate this discussion with these distinguished panelists. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. First, we have with us Tino Cuéllar, who is the president of Carnegie and a former Supreme Court justice for the state of California. He's also a veteran of two US presidential administrations. We also have Yael Berda, who's an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Hebrew University and a non-resident fellow with the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's also a practicing human rights lawyer representing clients in military and district courts, as well as the Supreme Court in Israel. We also have Suha Salman Mousa, who is the executive director of the Mosawa Center, as well as their sister organization, which is called the Friends of Mosawa, and she works on the advocacy for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And last but certainly not least, we have Daniel Levy, who's the president of the U.S. Middle East Project, which is focused on finding a mutually agreeable and mutually respectful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has also worked for Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Rabin and was deeply involved in the peace talks, which we had in a long time. Tino, you and I were speaking last night and talking about how difficult this issue has become to discuss. And I said to you, this reminds me increasingly of that Daily Show sketch where Jon Stewart, no matter what he says about Israel or Palestine, people pop up from underneath the desk and start screaming at him. And it feels like we're there right now. It has become very difficult to discuss this issue. And that, of course, has implications for policy, right? If this becomes such a difficult issue to discuss respectfully, calmly, then how can we navigate our way out of this? So Tino, I wanted to ask you, why do you think this issue is so emotionally charged? And why is it so impossible, seemingly, to talk about this with people you don't agree with?
Julia, thank you. And I very much appreciate not only your role as moderator and the work that you do, but also this extraordinary panel and the work that this panel does. I have to say that as we speak, it is just impossible to have a conversation about this without acknowledging the horror of the October 7 attack and what it meant for those of us who have followed international law and international security ethics for a long time. It's horrifying. And what it meant and how it destroyed so many lives means that you can't have a conversation about discourse and civic space without acknowledging that reality, and that no history, no context justifies that kind of action. And we're going to live with that horror for a long time. By the same token, the reason why at this moment discussions of how to go forward, how to improve the lives in the region, how to take the law and the ethics seriously, but at the same time recognize Israel's own determined right to defend itself. I think it goes to two things. The first thing is just the reality that oftentimes when people have disagreements and they go to the essence of who they are and whether they have a right to be in a certain region, whether a particular entity has a right to exist, it just becomes very difficult to get to the next part of the conversation. The question about what to do or what the policy should be. That essential starting point in the conversation is one that requires a great deal sometimes of skill, patience, and empathy to overcome, particularly against the backdrop of such horror. That's one. Two, my colleagues at Carnegie and I, 170 scholars in 20 different countries, we grapple with the harder questions, the things that really end up not being easy to resolve overnight or even over a decade. What to do about nuclear weapons, how to deal with the horrific conflict in Ukraine, for example. And here, as we play out what happens next, in Israel and Gaza, it's impossible to deny that the complexities are real. The questions about how exactly you plan an operation to limit the impact on civilians, how exactly you take the law seriously, but at the same time, that sense of urgency that policymakers understandably have as they're trying to protect civilian populations in Israel. So I think, it goes to a question about identity, but at the same time, the reality that the nuances of policy actually matter. And at that point, their patience can run out. And it's genuinely vexing, even for the most thoughtful experts. Julia,
Suha, yeah, showing my age here. So one of the issues that I've encountered in thinking about this, reading about this, reporting on it, writing about it, is that sometimes the discourse in our public spaces can feel quite divorced from what's actually happening on the ground. So I wanted to ask Suha, what has life been like for Arab Israelis, for Palestinians in Israel, both citizens of Israel and those living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank? We know more about Gaza. What has life been like since October 7th, and how did the events of October 7th affect that community?
First of all, thank you, Julia, for this question, and thank you, Carnegie, for inviting us and having us in this important webinar. First of all, for the people that do not know, the Palestinian Arab community in Israel is about 21% of the country's population, and has historically faced various legal challenges and oppression. But with the outbreak of the war on October 7th, these challenges have been increased, affecting almost every aspect of our daily lives. So in my presentation, per your request, I would like to brief about the impact of the war on our community. So I will start with the civilians' casualties. I don't know if anybody knows, but on the first day of the war, 20 civilians from the Bedouin community, including women and children, have been killed on October 7th. These civilians live in the Negev, in the southern of Israel. Many others were injured, and dozens of houses were destroyed, as well as actually 6 people were taken as prisoners at Hamas. 2 of them, by the way, a sister and brother, will be released today, and hopefully in the next hour or two, as part of the prisoners exchange deal. Most victims are part of thousands of the Bedouin community in the Naqab that live in unrecognized villages, which in regular times has no infrastructures or any basic amenities. For instance, no running waters, no electricity, and during wartime, they do not have any shelters or any safe rooms. And even the Iron Dome didn't work during rocket attacks, since it is considered an open spaces or open fields. So the absence of shelters and the Iron Dome forced families, including children, into a terrifying reality where open spaces provided the only refuge for these families. Moreover, these villages lack with basic medical services, and even ambulances of Magen David Adom did not provide their services to these communities. So since October 7th, the Israeli government declared that Israel is in a war and it's a state of emergency. For us, it's meaning military rules that had directed and dangerous impact on our community. I'll start with the most thing that we haven't experienced this before, not in 2021, May 2021, or even in October 2000. I'm talking about shrinking spaces and oppression of freedom of the expression. Till today, more than 450 people from the Palestinian community have been arrested or investigated because they posted on social media or on WhatsApp groups posts against the war or showed any solidarity with the people of Gaza. Or even write something from the Quran, or some student wrote, "Good morning, it's a beautiful morning on the 7th of October," without knowing what's happening on the 7th of October. So these arrests targeted especially college and university students, especially females, and also lecturers, physicians, medical staff, employees, journalists, human rights activists, and etc. By the way, in order to humiliate them, especially the females and the students, and they spread fear and terror among the Palestinian community, the police even published videos of their arrests from their bedrooms and then published their photos with their handcuffed and behind them the Israeli flag, as they were already indicted. As for today, we have more than 90 we have more than 160 detainees, and the police tried. I'm sorry? Can you hear me?
Yes, keep going.
And the police filed more than 90 charges using the anti-terrorism law in these indictments. Moreover, disciplinary actions have been taken against more than 160 students from 33 academic institutes, and dozens were expelled from their colleges and universities, including professors. The incitements and the harassments against students did not stop there. I'm pretty sure some of you saw that on Saturday evening, October 28th, hundreds of racist groups attacked physically the dorms in Netanya College, demanding to throw out the Arab students from their dorms. During this dangerous incident, they were shouting "Death to Arabs." And eventually, we as the Musawa Center and the Knesset members and other political leaders managed after hours to help these students to escape, literally to escape from their dorms and go back to their families. By the way, the students were not allowed to go back to their dorms. Arab students usually in the summertime, they work in order to, to help their parents to pay the tuition for the colleges. So the organization or the company, that is managing the dorms, they did not allow them to go back to their dorms because they said that this is for security reasons, for their security reasons. By the way, we at the Musawa Center filed a lawsuit against the company, and yesterday we had a hearing at the court, and the judge gave a decision to allow students to go back to their dorms. As for workplaces, and this is a crucial issue in our community, there were more than 350 cases of harassment and discrimination in workplaces against Arab workers. And we dealt with dozens of firing people from their workplaces. By the way, we are dealing with firing 8 female workers from one branch of a known supermarket chain, and we're gonna follow up with them on a legal side. Adding to all what I have been talking, the police commissioner is preventing the Palestinian community in Israel from organizing peaceful protests to raise their voice against the war within the Arab towns or villages, even like a protest under 50 people, which by the way, the law allow it without any permission from the police or the police commissioner. The police didn't allow it. And few weeks ago, some of the former MKs wanted to protest and hold one sign saying ceasefire. they were arrested, and the high follow-up committee, the chair of the high follow-up committee, was arrested in Nazareth on his way to the protest. They even prevented, by the way, a meeting to take place between Palestinian citizens activists and Jewish citizens activists to raise their voice against the war. By the way, the oppression and the harassment is also took place against Knesset members like Aida Touma Sliman and Yassin. They were asked, or they were suspended from attending the Knesset meetings. Aida Touma Sliman for I think 2 months, and Iman Khatib Yassin for 2 weeks, by the way, and as well Ofer Kasif. So these are some of the the daily cases or topics or harassments or attacks, whatever you want to call it, or silencing us that we are dealing with. Adding to all that, the Israeli government, they have trying to implement and to pass dangerous policies and propose such policies. For instance, the passage of extension of the counterterrorism law, the conception of terror publications that could lead to a year in prison if the conception of material. They say that as a potential leading of brainwashing. There was a proposed bill in the Knesset which seeks to introduce a death penalty for terrorism offenses, as well as the far-right National Security Minister, Ben Gvir. He initiated what is called armed local patrol groups, in Hebrew called Kitot Konanut, and eased the requirements for obtaining gun license for civilians. And I'm talking about civilians, Jewish civilians, Jewish Israelis, because his argument is that they want to protect the Jewish neighborhoods from Arab citizens of the State of Israel. To conclude, I'm concluding. To conclude, it's important to acknowledge that there is a rise in hate crime and increase in physical and verbal assaults against Palestinian Arab citizens, and no one from the Jewish Israeli citizens who attacked Palestinian citizens, including the ones who attacked the students in Netanya, no one was arrested or even investigated. We are facing an organized racist incitement, a campaign by the ultra-right-wing associations and parties aimed to delegitimize our community, and the goal also to delegitimize the progressive Arab Jewish movement.
Thank you, Suha, for that heartrending and honestly infuriating update. Yael, I wanted to ask you about the Israeli side. And, there have been also reports that it is harder for Israelis to express opinions that are not maybe in line with what the government is pushing. What has October 7th and the war in Gaza done to civic spaces in Israel? And I ask you this as an expert in the topic. What does it feel like for Israelis?
So first of all, thank you very much for holding this meeting. I think it's really very important, and thank you, Suha, for your words. I want to reiterate and acknowledge October 7th as this historic event, and how deeply affected all of Israel is, both Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. This is very important. So the way it's affecting also the citizenship structure itself. But I'm not going to go into that because it's a little complicated. I also want to acknowledge the horrific civilian casualties in Gaza. And I think one can't speak about at this moment without acknowledging that. And I think the impacts of that devastation are just as important for our understanding, for our analysis, and for our ability to move forward. So just as we acknowledge the horrific atrocities that I can't fathom why people can't address them sometimes, we have to acknowledge how intertwined and interconnected we all are in this land. And so yeah, sorry.
I
But
just,
I'm
just
gonna
wanted
answer
to,
the question.
yeah, but I just
Saying
wanted to
what I
interrupt
just said-
real quick.
Saying what I just said in this panel, I probably could not say it unless I was taking part in a Zoom or a webinar with Jews and Israelis, Jews and Palestinian Israelis together. There would be no way to actually say what I just said, because even the expression of sadness or regret over the civilian casualties in Gaza is considered to be something that is outside a legitimate speech. So it's not just about organizing a protest, which one can't do. I mean, there was one protest that was enabled by the Supreme Court. One had to petition the Supreme Court in order to do that, but it's literally wherever one goes, the people are very careful and fearful of what they're saying, and even the expression of doubt about Israeli military tactics and results. I mean, this is all something that people are very careful about. Now, it's also coming from the government, but it's also social pressure. We have to always remember that interconnection there, and the way that legitimacy narrows, because that's exactly what happens to civic space. It's never only about government measures. It's never only about official blocks and impediments. It's about what we deem possible to talk about in public sphere. And so I want to go into a little bit. So Suha has spoken about what's happening in academic spaces, but we have to also realize that this is happening in universities after the universities are pushing back the Minister of Education that wanted to have direct oversight over any of these cases. So this is even happening with an intervention demanding independence of the academic institutions. So just to kind of frame it, I think maybe even more important is what is happening on social media. Palestinian citizens of Israel are not on social media. They can't be. And when they are, they're posting pictures of cats and roses, because there's such a deep fear, and it's even in WhatsApp groups. Now, I want to talk about this for a minute in conjunction with the political crisis inside Israel, because people sometimes forget that we are actually amidst a massive political crisis where there was the government introduced a judicial overhaul, which some of us call the regime coup. And there has been a protest movement for 10 months that was protesting basically authoritarian practices that Netanyahu's government was introducing. And so what's happening now is that whole gambit of laws, of policies, of directives that they tried to do previous to October 7th, under the guise of the war. Some of the government's ministers are pushing those policies with great success because of the impossibility to protest. And so I think also another thing that we have to remember is the hostages. So the civic issue in Israel is to bring back the hostages. And that's where we actually see a lot of the the political energy going to? In a kind of, if you want to speak civilian, you speak about saving life. And that's something important to watch, and also thankfully has been successful at this until now. And I hope it continues. And we see more release of all the hostages. But all this to say that there's a direct relationship between what's happening on the ground. So one can't say, oh, okay, there's a war. This is why these policies are taking place. It has everything to do with the attempt to go full authoritarian by Netanyahu's government. I realize that what I'm saying sounds very dramatic. The reason that I'm sounding so dramatic is because it is. Like way before October 7th, we were sounding alarms on that all stops were like being pulled on free speech, on oversight of the police, on the massive use of the anti-terrorism law. This was already happening, and now it's just under the fog of war. All of it is happening to a great extent.
Yeah, Yael, what you're saying actually reminds me of President Biden's words right after October 7th. He warned President Netanyahu, or Prime Minister Netanyahu, excuse me, to not repeat the mistakes of 9/11 that America committed after 9/11, which was a lot of this, right? Under the fog of war, you push through a lot of authoritarian-like measures. And the reason I interrupted you earlier is, I guess it's actually more of a question for Daniel, is that exactly what you were saying, that holding both the sadness and the grief for both of those things, both what happened on our, which we're still learning more and more about, especially as details of the sexual assault and rape come to light, as well as, you know, the Israeli offensive in Gaza and the massive humanitarian disaster it's created, the catastrophic loss of life, that somehow you can't, we're no longer in a place, it seems, in Israel, outside of it, where you can hold sadness and grief for both those things, and not like in the Jon Stewart sketch, get yelled at. Daniel, you're in the West, you're in the diaspora. Why are those two things compatible in so many people, and how are the labels that are being tossed around by both sides affecting, you know, the chance of this coming to some kind of mutually acceptable political resolution? Because this is at its core a political crisis.
Indeed, and thanks, Julia, and it's good to be on the panel with the others. I'm kind of expecting those heads to pop up from the Jon Stewarts. People have to look it up, because otherwise I'll have no idea what we've been riffing on. But it's nice to have a rare smile on one's face talking about these things, and unfortunately that smile will be banished now as one dives into it. So I've tried to make the case a little bit along the lines that you've just suggested in these past weeks, that I don't know how one can come at this without being able to hold simultaneously three thoughts. And for me, those consist of the following. Number one, October 7th was a horrendous attack which cannot be justified. By the way, I think there are accusations as to what happened on October 7th, which have not been verified and which could end up undermining the reality of what happened on October 7th. And I would urge and there are things that have had to be taken down online. And so I would urge kind of the Israeli PR machine not to go there, because I think it's a stupid, dangerous place to go, because October 7th was horrendous enough. And one has to be able to hold the fullness of that horror. Number two, what has been done to the Palestinian civilian population of Gaza basically every day since is horrendous, and will almost certainly also amount to a war crime when the fullness of that investigation is pursued. The fact that on day one, the first response was to announce the collective punishment of the civilian population with the ending of food, water, medical supplies, assistance. And it has only got worse since then. I mean, to be frank, that the New York Times can run a story which says, by conservative estimate, the number of Palestinian women and children killed in 2 months in Gaza is double the number of women and children killed in almost 2 years in Ukraine. I mean, that just takes time to sink in. And one fears we could be back there within a few days. And it's worth looking up what Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, has said today, because not only is it now the deaths from direct bombardment, but it's also the impact of the dire humanitarian conditions, sanitation conditions, absence of clean water, etc., and the disease that is rampant. So hold those two things. Then one has to hold another thing, which importantly does not justify anything, but one cannot understand without context. On October 6th, Israelis lived a pretty normal life. On October 6th, Palestinians were subject to the structural violence of a permanent military occupation and of a regime that has been, with a high degree of legal accuracy, defined as meeting the definition of apartheid, not only by Palestinians, but by Israeli human rights organizations, and of course by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in the last 2 to 3 years. Now, why is it so difficult to hold those three things simultaneously? And that, I think, takes us into the terrain of this conversation around the discourse, because the starting point has tended not to be that, but the starting point, and because this is sensitive stuff, I'm going to look at some things I jotted down earlier, but I'm not going to take too long, I promise. The starting point has tended to be evocations of fear, trauma, hierarchies of victimhood, exceptionalist demands for denunciation. And it becomes so difficult because it's embedded in a story. And you said I'm in diaspora, which is, of course, a very loaded term, right? Diaspora applies, there's a center and there's an outside. And so, unfortunately, and I think this makes it really difficult for people not of my community, not of my faith, to feel, how do I get into this? Because this also comes down to, what does Jewish identity look like for an awful lot of the community, and the extent to which Israel has become the secular religion for so many people of a Jewish background, and the role that anti-Semitism and how it has transitioned in how it's defined has come to play. So there is, of course, a history of thousands of years of Jewish life, and then there's a history of how diaspora interacts with Israel in the age of Zionist hegemony. And it has gone through different iterations, pre-state, immediately post-state. People, and I won't have time to go into it, but something like the Blaustein-Ben Gurion understandings, where actually mainstream American Jewish communal leadership early on said, hey, we speak for the Jews in America. Israel will support you, but stay out of our affairs. We are the interpreters and the defenders of Jewish life. Until you've reached this moment of, and probably right now we are in the moment of maximum symbiosis between those two things. Now, you can only make sense of this if one understands that at a certain point, and I think this is rational in terms of Israeli statecraft, that at a certain point, the state of Israel realized things are not going to get better for the Palestinians. That's not the policy. People are increasingly going to call out the realities on the ground. And perhaps one of the best tools in opposing that is to go on a journey of redefining what constitutes anti-Semitism. So change the terms of the debate. Rather than responding to how do you answer the fact that your state is an apartheid state? If you were Israel, you'd much rather be having the argument, well, how dare you say that? You must be an anti-Semite. And here I've teed up a definition of anti-Semitism, which means the very framing of that question means you violated that. Ian Lustig, amongst others, has written of the Holocaustization of how we see the Palestine conflict. It's not new. Menachem Begin in the Lebanon War talked about Arafat being in the equivalent of Hitler's bunker. There's a government ministry in Israel was created to run this campaign of delegitimization of criticism of Israel. So you get to this place where October 7th happens and it's autoplay. The terrain has been primed for a certain kind of debate, which is a debate that is absolutely antithetical to problem solving. And if there have been, people may have come across what Omar Bartov at Brown University has been saying, and I'd urge people to look it up if they haven't seen it. So this is one of the preeminent Jewish Israeli genocide Holocaust scholars who's looking at this and screaming really about what's going on, and is dismissed. Many of the most preeminent tenured Holocaust, Jewish studies, Jewish history scholars are being totally dismissed because it doesn't fit in the narrative. And when people look and say, wow, those Jewish Voice for Peace, those If Not Now guys, they seem pretty worked up and agitated, don't they? And I think they're so agitated because this feels to them like they are doing the most Jewish thing, and yet it is very marginalized in the community because the terrain has been so primed. Let me make one last comment, if I may, because I think this is crucial. If you add another layer to this very problematic reality that I've described, which is power asymmetries. So there's a power asymmetry over there where Yael and Suha are. And that's the power asymmetry between an occupying state and an occupied people. But there's a power asymmetry in Western democracy and in the US. And maybe I can best capture that power asymmetry by calling it campus versus Congress. So campus may sound very loud, but Congress is where you appropriate money and weaponry to send to one side of this conflict. And that power asymmetry, I think, also leads to people thinking, how do we get our voice heard in a democracy where, even where much of the public is at, where justice seems to be at, is totally out of kilter with where our political dynamics are at. Someone has called this, reported on several meetings with racial justice advocates and said people were calling this a global George Floyd moment. And let me say as a last sentence, it may be a long sentence, but not that long a sentence, that what I fear, amongst other things, is, of course, for the situation over there, and I think this is an administration that has now thoroughly tied itself up in knots and is bleeding political capital, is bleeding global credibility, but also people are just bleeding. And alongside that, it leads us to, I think, the worst place we could be, where at a time where there is rising intolerance, where there is rising right-wing ethno-nationalist extremism, far-right extremism, where you have communities that are all impacted by that, absolutely at loggerheads with each other, unable to do joint anti-racism work. And you end up having people saying things like, in my community, saying things like, this can never happen in the only place in the world where Jews are supposed to be safe. Because just think about that for a moment. And again, it goes back to this question of diaspora. Wait, have you preemptively given up the idea that Jews in America are supposed to be safe? Jews in Britain, Jews in Germany are supposed to be safe? So we get ourselves into a contortionist space, which I think is really to the detriment of the communities at loggerheads with each other.
Thank you, Daniel. I think you've hit on a lot of important points, and I wonder how much of that is because October 7th hit such a nerve, and it accessed such deep historical trauma not just for Jews in Israel, but for Jews in the, and I say the diaspora because we're talking to people on the panel who are actually there on the
Can
ground.
I say one sentence on that, Julia?
Sure, of course.
Thanks, because I think you're absolutely right. And that is the most accessible sentence to Jewish communities, and it's the most accessible sentence to the mainstream media in America. However, what has happened subsequent to October 7th hits an incredibly painful nerve for Palestinians.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
for the Nakba, and when Israeli politicians openly talk about and that does not hit an accessible nerve for people who are exposed to your mainstream media. That hits a wait. What do you mean? Nuck what? Nuck who? I'm going to Google that. Holocaust, I know. Nakba, years, decades of Palestinian dispossession, decades of structural violence. This stuff I'm not really so familiar with. And that's part of the problem, of course.
Sure, though I would argue that's changing, especially in the US and I would say in the UK, where the populations, especially the younger population, are much more diverse and have access to diverse points of view. One last thing I'll say before I open it up for questions is, and I'm expecting the heads to pop up and yell at me, but I've seen, just as somebody who has covered the war in Ukraine the entire time it's been happening, I've seen a lot of comparisons between the death tolls, and I think we also are in danger of getting into, like you said, victim hierarchies, et cetera. The verified death toll in Ukraine is quite low, and it is certainly multiples higher. It's been very slow to catch up in Ukraine for some reason to the actual deaths, but that is neither here nor there. I want to open this up for audience questions. We have about 15 minutes.
Really, while you're opening it up, I just wanted to make two quick observations. I appreciated the distinction Daniel was drawing between campus and Congress, and I acknowledge that. But I also want to note that one should not undersell the enormous importance of campuses as areas where discourse develops and begins to influence the rest of the country ultimately, and particularly at a generational level, gives you a sense of where the discourse is going. That makes me concerned about anti-Semitism. Like, I don't think that in any way sort of casts aside some of the issues we've talked about here. But, in the US, just to pick one statistic, the FBI indicates that in 2022, 55% of the religion-focused hate crimes were against folks who are Jewish. And I do think that the challenge we are all facing, in a sense, we may disagree about this or that particular detail, but what I think cuts across every statement here is the importance of building in enough room for honest, respectful discussion and deliberation. I do not see how we get to a place where there are fewer Palestinian lives being lost, for example, as Israel legitimately defends its interests, without some of that open discussion and honesty and ability to connect with each other. And I do think it's worth noting that that requires more than the right government policy, although it does require that, right? Governments have a right to stop incitement to violence, to stop direct material support, but ideally not to cut off the kind of deliberation and discussion that lets people hear each other and understand each other and change minds. But it also requires norms of discourse and respect, an ability to hold those multiple thoughts that Daniel was talking about. So to my mind, that is work for all of us. It means sometimes reconciling our emotions with our thoughts, but also trying to keep the emotional piece to one side enough that we can listen to each other and understand a perspective from somebody who disagrees with us, because otherwise there's no clear way forward on the policy.
Yeah. I was going to say, how do you think this has affected policy so far as you've been observing this round of violence?
Well, I mean, there's the U.S. question, and then there's a question in other parts of the world, and certainly in Israel. And I would just observe here that for the people who are closest to the decision making, and they are in a really, really difficult place because they recognize the U.S. has long-term interests and reasons to be involved in supporting Israel. But at the same time, there's grave concern, and I see this from the Biden administration about the Palestinian lives that are being lost and how to sort of put Israel in a position to defend its interests, defend its security, but limit the loss of civilian life that raises the deepest legal and ethical questions. And that, I think, is a project that is benefited by broader discourse in society where people can talk to each other and listen to opposing points of view. And I think the narrowing of that space has left the administration with a much bigger challenge trying to understand how it's trying to thread the needle and strike that balance.
Yeah. And it looks like we've, while we're waiting for questions, it looks like we've lost Yael, but Suha, what you talked about, it's incredibly striking, right? That, under, hi Yael, she's back.
Right. Yeah.
But I was asking Suha, often you hear the Israeli government push back on claims of apartheid and, saying that they're not democratic by saying, like, well, look, we have this large Arab Palestinian population. 1/5 of our country is not Jewish, and they have full rights, and they can do what they live just like Israelis do. And Suha, what you're saying is, under the cover of war, a lot of that space is being shut down, particularly for the Palestinian population of Israel. Yeah, that's a statement to invite you to talk.
It was a question or a statement?
Both. I just wanted to for you to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, yes, absolutely. We are considered since the I'm just going to start about the Jewish nation state law, that we are now like second-class citizens. And we, as a Palestinian community, we really fight.
Can you explain that law for people who don't know what it is in the audience?
Yeah, so the Jewish nation state law, and you can, Yael, help me with that, was passed in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, right? And this gives self-determination for the Jewish people and not for the Palestinian people, and downgrade one of the articles is downgrading the language, the Arabic language in Israel. But most importantly is that the only self-determination is for the Jewish people and not for the Palestinian people. And if you would like to appeal, some of the people or some of the groups, especially from Arab countries, appealed to the Supreme Court against this law, and it was denied. And since this law and the Israeli political atmosphere is going to the right side, ultra-right wing, and now we are facing this very settler government with the coalition that is around Netanyahu's government. And before the 7th of October, there were a lot of policies that Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu itself, as part of the judicial coup as well, is trying to pass against the Palestinian community in order to silence us, in order to shrink spaces, as well as in order to cut funds and allocate funds to the Arab community inside Israel. So it has been a systematic discrimination through the years, but after 7th of October, it's been really silencing us in terms of terrorizing us. There's a lot of fear. Yael said no one can, that we have no, we don't use the social media platform anymore because we are afraid if we follow any organization in, for instance, any human rights organization, and people will follow them, they will be called for investigation why we are following this, website or this Facebook of them. If we put like on something, they will interrupt it and they will translate it that we support Hamas and we support terrorism. It's been really, I don't know what the word that can I use. it's been a madness here. Like, we are citizens. We did not, from 48, we had only using, peaceful demonstrations, peaceful protests. We didn't use any, armed or weapons if we would like to speak out. It's only by the law. And now they are accusing our young people, students, of supporting terrorism. This is something that haven't experienced before. And yes, this government is trying still to pass a very dangerous policies, especially against the Arab community. But I think, and Yael can also elaborate here, against the left side or the progressive Jewish that is trying now. By the way, there were silence from 7th of October, but now, like in the last few weeks, we can hear Jewish Israelis, progressive, that they are trying to talk and have these efforts with the Palestinian community inside Israel in terms of activists and also political leaders in order to bring our voices together against the war. So hopefully that we together can take a significant role in order to stop this war, to stop this madness, because otherwise everybody knows that military actions can have, specific or military actions have a very impact or dangerous impact, but they do not shape the political atmosphere that it should be, especially in this area. One last sentence I would like to add. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad things is happening, but if we look about a positive something that happened since this war and the brutal attack on 7th of October on civilians, Israeli civilians, and we as a Palestinian community do not accept any attack on civilians. It doesn't matter if it's a Jew, Druze, or a Muslim, or Palestinians. The international community has more attention of what is going on with the Palestinian, the Palestinian case, and has more attention with what is happening inside of Israel. And this is something that we, as advocacy centers, as people that are dealing with organizations and with policies and communicate with Congress members and even parliament members, should be elaborate this issue. Hopefully that we can have really bring all parties for really a real peace talk and not ignore the Palestinian case.
Speaking of peace talks, I know, Julia, you're probably going to ask us about the audience question on what the U.S. government can do and what civilians can do. I just wanted to briefly call out the work that is being done by Bill Burns and by the U.S. government to try to get hostages home and try to increase the pause in the hostilities, because that does save lives, and nobody benefits from what's happening to these hostages. I would just note that. And as far as concerned American citizens, to my mind, many of the ideas that have been before us in the last few minutes have been really about the importance of holding different, seemingly opposing notions at the same time, about how tragic it absolutely is to see the loss of life in Gaza among civilians, but at the same time, how we ought to be very honest about how horrific the situation was on October 7th and the aftermath of that. To the extent that citizens can keep the ability to listen to respectfully expressed ideas that they do not agree with, that is how we're going to get to a better place. And it's going to take some time, but it's going to require effort and determination at the individual level.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that of the other panelists. The audience question was what you think the best roles are for, 1, the U.S. government, 2, concerned U.S. citizens, and 3, foundations and philanthropy to end the violence and to start a real meaningful peace process. Yael, you wanted to say something?
Wow, I have a few hats here. I'm going to shout out to Land for All. Look it up. Look up the Land for All initiative. I think that the most important thing is, first of all, it is, if we're talking about dialogue, so already begin by asking yourself if what you're listening to is the intention behind it to advance peace, de-escalation, and save lives in the long term? Or is it aimed at more conflict and legitimizing killing? And if it's two, then don't say it, or pay less attention to people saying it. There have been such incredible, responsible people, I think, both in Israel and Palestine, across all the different spaces, that under very difficult conditions are trying to keep things together. There are forces that are trying to escalate and do harm, the extremist, fundamentalist forces. And against those forces that have already done such horrific harm, in front of that, kind of holding on. And when we talk about voices, it's not necessarily what's loud or quiet, right? It's about what people are saying. Is it life-giving? Is it life-giving? Can it promote shared life? Because none of us are going anywhere. Nobody is going anywhere. And as soon as everyone can feel that and sense that and acknowledge that, this is a very important part of it. That's the thing. When people are crying Nakba, you have to counteract it and say, this thing is not happening no matter what. And when people are saying, go back to Europe, you stand there and counteract that. And you say nobody is going nowhere. And I think that kind of holding on and working with the people that can make life happen. And there are so many here. That's the thing. You don't hear them. You don't listen to them, but they're here, and there is life-giving forces. And I think those are the forces that need to be supported. And listening to them and growing them and helping them is something that can really, really make a difference.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end this panel on than Yael, beautiful words, to remind everyone to focus on what is life-giving, life-saving, and mutually respectful, even when we disagree. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to Tino, and thank you so much to Carnegie for hosting this very important discussion. And thank you all to our audience members for tuning in. Have a great day, and remember what Yael said.
Thank you.
Thank you.